Can we commune with it, know its intentions, cooperate with its direction? Here, we define threshold as a gateway state of awareness, allowing mankind to cross into a place of real cognition. Threshold allows us to approach questions of higher reality through the door of experience, rather than mere belief. Welcome to Threshold, where we tear away the veil from commercial media, bringing our audience and participants into another realm of reality and enhanced communication.
Hi, this is Johnny Bluestar. Today's guest has one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. His name is Robert Snow, and he is a retired police captain and homicide detective that was working in the Indianapolis Police Department with a superb record of dealing with the most challenging of police assignments. The story you're about to hear in this interview is unusual because although there are by now many stories about reincarnation out there, seldom has the subject of these stories been as fully qualified to seek for proof as Bob Snow, a detective. The evidence that Bob Snow was after was to validate the reality of a past life incarnation. That's right. Under the capable hands of a hypnotist who specialized in hypnotic regression, Bob Snow had an experience that was to throw him off the train, a train that was on a rather standard track of believing that reincarnation was a New Age fantasy, incapable of being proved or understood objectively. His book is called Portrait of a Past Life Skeptic, and is one of the most engaging books I've ever read. Why so engaging? Simply because it is so riveting and so very unusual, like a good detective story. Actually, maybe more accurately, a mystery story, which it really is. So let's get going. How's it going today, Bob?
Fine. Thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, and it's very exciting for me. Before we get into the guts of your story, tell us a little bit about your own background. I understand that since you were young, you always wanted to be a writer.
Actually, that's the only thing I ever wanted to be. Since my youngest age of 4 or 5, when everyone would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, the only thing I ever said was a writer. I never wanted to be anything else. I'm not sure why, but I always wanted, that's all I ever wanted to be, was a writer.
Well, that's cool. I know, because I kind of experienced wanting to be a writer when I was really young, like in second grade myself. You know, I think the circumstances of your growing up were very interesting, but not all that easy. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Indianapolis, and a kind of a rough side of Indianapolis called Brightwood, and I grew up with 7 brothers and 3 sisters. So it was, needless to say, it was a tough. Yeah, it was a tough childhood. You have to say, we lived in a three-bedroom house with. I lived with slept in one room with 7 brothers. So it was needless to say, it was different. It was interesting growing up. It was crowded, but there's always something going on. Needless to say.
Sounds a little bit like going to summer camp.
Yeah, except permanently. Yes.
Yes. Well, one of the interesting things about your life is that you actually did become a writer, a rather prolific one. But you also had a very productive career as a police officer, 38 years, retiring in the rank of captain after running the Homicide Division as its commander for quite a number of years. And before that, you were actually an intelligence officer during the war in Vietnam. Tell us a little bit more about these aspects of your career.
Well, actually, when I turned 18, of course, this was 1965, and the Vietnam War was starting to get hot, and I got drafted a couple weeks after I turned 18, so I went down and, have a smart job when you're 18. I'm not going to get drafted and serve 2 years. I went down and signed up to the Air Force for 4 years. But anyway, but I got into intelligence, and it was a fascinating job. It really was. I did intelligence during the Vietnam War, and it was a great job. Then when I got out, of course, I never ever gave up wanting to be a writer. But when people start out being a writer, no one starts out being a writer as your number one, as your number one career. You always have to have another career to support you until you get established. And so when I got out in the USA, I was looking for a job, and my brother had become an Indianapolis police officer about 7 or 8 months before that. And of course, this was 1969. And the Vietnam War was still going on. And the police department was desperate for new officers since all the physically fit people were being drafted and sent off to Vietnam. So I went down and applied just to have a job to tide me over while I was going to become a writer. And it was actually a very good decision because not only was it a good job that I stayed there 38 years, but it gave me tons of subject material for my writing.
Musical scores for advertising, television or film, video, audio editing, etc. We want to promote products and projects that support the environment, encourage a healthy experience in living, developing, nurturing, and useful technology, and offering platforms for positive, socially constructive entertainment or informative, transformative media. Our experience in creating a variety of products like this is rather vast, and we offer client-based and collaborative products, as well as the opportunity of active investors to join us in the creation and promotion of proprietary products, some of which are in latter stages of development. For more information, go to www.newgalaxyenterprises.com. That's www.newgalaxyenterprises.com. If you're interested in talking to us, just fill out the contact sheet and we will get back with you.
Boots in Manhattan is a coming-of-age novel by Ray Boylan and Johnny Bluestar. It is about a young Tom Boots Raymond who grows up in New York in the 1940s who is a member of a street gang.
My friends and I were about to start our own game of stickball when Rabbit Lacey, the head of the Rattlers, came up to us and tried to move in on our game. We were called Dwarves, the youngest members of this stupid gang.
Hey, Kevin, I need you to get some gloves and some stuff I left at my place.
No, this is our game.
Hey, are you my good little dwarf or what?
You've been calling me a dwarf since I was 6. We're not your personal slaves, pal.
Hey, what is this? A dwarf rebellion? All right, big guy. We ditched the dwarf thing. We make you guys regular rattlers.
No, it's too late.
He looked at Jay and me. We looked away. Rabbit was now angry, and he pushed Kevin hard with the palms of his hand. Kevin tried to ram him in the stomach, but he stepped aside, throwing Kevin into the curb where he fell to the ground, bleeding profusely at the knee. Still, he managed to get up.
My street.
Kevin shouted at Rabbit, pointing at him with an angry index finger.
Find out more by Googling Boots in Manhattan, a 1940s coming-of-age novel, part 1 of the novel series The Foot Soldier by Ray Boylan and Johnny Bluestar. Google with the words Boots in Manhattan, Ray Johnny Kendall. That's Boots in Manhattan, Ray Johnny Kendall.
We're back with Robert Snow and a rather remarkable story of past lifetimes. Robert, I believe your first little excursion in the past lifetimes investigation, at least intellectually, was from a book you received in a book club called Coming Back, which was written by Dr. Raymond Moody. How did that book affect you?
Well, when you're a writer, you just can't write all the time, too. Another thing you have to do, you have to read, and you have to read a lot. And you can't just read from your field. You have to read from all different fields to see how authors handle things. In other words, if something's really good, why was it good? And if it's bad, why was it bad? Because of this, I belong to a number of book clubs and I do a lot of reading. Well, one time I won a book club thing. I had a book called Coming Back by Dr. Raymond Moody. And basically, it was about Dr. Moody had done some investigation in near-death experiences, and apparently he had a friend who was a past life regressionist, and she talked him into being hypnotized and supposedly taken back to, I think it was like 8 or 9 past lives. Anyway, so I ordered the book. It sounded interesting, but I didn't give it any kind of, credence or belief, but I thought it sounded interesting. And again, you want to see how other writers handle subjects. So I got the book and I read it. It was a very well-written book about how he goes to his friend. She hypnotizes him and takes him back to all these past lives he's supposed to have had. But it's kind of funny because at the end of the book, he kind of hedges a bit, says, I'm not sure what this was. He's not really sure it's past lives. It might just been, his imagination or subconscious suggestions, what have you. And that's kind of how I felt at the time. I thought, it's interesting. But anything you think is past life is probably more likely memories from this life brought up to your subconscious mind and just reordered to make them look like stories. So I didn't give it much more thought. I read the book, then went on to other readings. So it was interesting, but I didn't really believe it more than he did.
Well, I think you wound up doing a lot more investigation than he did about your past lifetimes.
Yeah, I did eventually, yes.
Sometime after you read that book, you happened to be chatting in a function at the Marion County Family Advocacy Center with a friend of your wife. Like your wife, Melanie, Kathy Graban was a child abuse detective, but she was also a practicing psychologist who used hypnotic regression therapy. When you expressed your skepticism about this book to Kathy kind of challenged you. Can you explain what she said and how this challenge affected you?
Well, I said we were at a party, and I was talking to Kathy, and we were just making small talk, as people do at parties, about movies we'd seen and everything, and started talking books we read. And I remember this book, and I just kind of mentioned it. Now, at this time, I didn't know that Kathy used past life regression or practice. I didn't know it was even used that much myself at that time. So she asked me what I thought of the book, and it had been late in the party, and I had a bit to drink. And I think I was probably a bit obnoxious, and I kind of made fun of the book. I kind of made fun of the whole idea of past life regression. That my point to her was, if there's such a thing as past lives, why hasn't anyone ever proven it? Why hadn't anyone ever shown proof of it? And again, I think I maybe got a little overbearing. But Kathy was very nice, very gracious, and she listened to me. And eventually, it got to the point where she basically dared me. Said, "If you think it's so silly, why don't you try it?" And at first, I said, "No, I ain't doing that. I'm not doing that." And then it got to the point. Got down to the point, gee, are you scared? And you don't want to ask a man or a police officer, you scared? Of course you're not scared. And eventually I said yes. I said I'd do it. And she wrote down the name of a colleague of hers who did past regression and says, go see this and try it yourself and see what you think. And I said I would. But the next morning you wake up and you're a lot more clear-headed, and I think, I ain't doing this. This is stupid. I'm not doing it. But then it seemed like, every time, it was funny, before this, I didn't run to Kathy that often. But it seemed like after this, I would run into her every day. And when I'd see her, she'd always ask me, say, have you made the appointment yet? And I'd always make some flimsy excuse about how, I've had meetings and reports, things, and we had so many homicides and this kind of thing, I couldn't do it. But it seemed like I'd run into her all the time, and it would drive me nuts. You say, oh, God, there she is again, and you'd make up some flimsy excuse. So finally, what happened? I got tired. After 5 or 6 times, I thought, this is silly. You had to hide from somebody, So I finally said, okay, I went ahead and made the appointment with this friend of hers, as a Dr. Mary Ellen Griffith. And what Dr. Griffith told me when I called her, she said, if you want to, you can bring your own tape recorder if you want to record a session. And I thought that was really a good idea, because what I was planning on doing is I wanted to go to this session. I had made my mind up. I was going to this session, and I was going to cooperate with Dr. Griffin 100%. But I was going to record it, and I'm going to show Kathy how silly it all was, because then I was convinced absolutely nothing would happen. It would just be an hour of my wasted time. But I wanted to prove to Kathy that I've been right, that this is all silliness. There was no truth to it.
When you went to see her the first time, what was your first impression of her? I mean, was it strange, or was it ordinary, or?
No, actually, Dr. Griffith, very nice lady, very gracious lady. It's kind of funny because her office looked just like I thought a psychologist, psychiatrist would look like. She had an old desk and a chair and a leather couch, and that was it. It's just the way I thought about it. But she was a very nice lady, very gracious, had kind of a funny, kind of a musical voice, very soothing kind of musical voice. And she was very gracious, and we talked for a little bit, and she was a very, very nice lady. And I kind of liked her immediately.
How did the regression session begin?
Well, first she asked me, she says, well, gee, what kind of problems do you think you need help with? And I told her, I said, I don't have any problems. I told her, I just thought past life regression was interesting, and I wanted to try it. And she didn't have any problem with that. She said, okay, no problem. She said, well, sit down. Well, actually, she's got to go to the couch. I didn't lay down. I thought, no, that's too much like you need help. Yeah, you really need help type thing. And I was still convinced that time I was going to show Kathy how silly this was. So I sat on the couch, and she said, close your eyes. And I did, and she started talking. Said, tell me about your college graduation. And so I told her about my college graduation, and then she went down and asked me about she said, tell me something about high school, grade school. And I could see what she's doing. I remember thinking at the time that she wouldn't be a very good interrogator, because you could anticipate what her next question was going to be. And believe me, as an interrogator, you never want your subject to know what your next question is going to be, because you can prepare for it. But anyway, she kept asking earlier. Remember, she said, I can see what she's doing. But again, I thought, hey, I'm cooperating 100%. I'm going to tell her everything she wants, I can think of. I'm not going to make anything up, certainly. I'm not going to tell her something I don't see, but I will cooperate just so I can show Kathy how silly it is.
Did you buy into her methodology when she asked you to rely on the guidance of the higher self in your regression?
Well, I thought it was kind of amusing. I thought it was kind of amusing, because she told me before we started that on our trip there would be a spirit guide of mine called my inner self that would protect me. And she said, "Somebody would circle me with a white light, protect me." And I thought, I tried to, I almost had to keep from laughing. I've been a police officer for a long time, and I'd been in a lot of dangerous, scary situations. I didn't think anything I would see sitting in a psychiatrist or psychologist office was going to scare me. But I went along with her. Okay, I nodded. I agreed. Whatever she wanted, I was going to go along with her. And I listened to her and nodded and everything. But I thought it was kind of silly at the time because, again, I didn't think I could see anything that I had that would certainly scare me.
Well, in the very beginning, she asked you to imagine yourself in another room in your den at home, seated in a comfortable chair. Why do you think she placed you in your own body, but in an imaginary body?
I don't know. The only thing I found about Dr. Griffin's method is she employed a lot of imagery. Imagine this. Imagine you're here. She told me find the most comfortable spot in your house. Imagine yourself sitting there. Imagine your inner self telling you that we're going on a trip. This kind of thing. I know she did involved a lot of imagery in her work. I'm not sure why. Again, I wasn't skilled in hypnotism. I didn't really know that much about it then, so I just went along with whatever she said.
Well, what did you think about the balloon ride?
Well, she did all this imagery about going to back in earlier memories. She said, "All right, so I want you to imagine a balloon. Can you see a balloon?" And actually, I was sitting there with my eyes closed. I've been sitting there probably about 15 minutes so far with my eyes closed. And I could see a big purple blob on my eyelids. I assumed it was just light coming in from the window. There was a window to my right, but I could see a big purple blob on my eyelids. I told her, "Yeah, I can see a purple balloon." And she told me, she said, "All right." She says, "Get in the balloon." And she said, "You and your inner self are going to take a trip." So she said, "Try imagine that." So I'm still being cooperative. I want to cooperate so I can show how silly this all is. So I cooperate, and she says, "Oh, we take the balloon." She says, "All right." She says, "Can you see lights down below you?" And interesting enough, out the bottom of my eyelids, I could see the little points of light down below, but I assumed it was simply reflection off the floor. So anyway, she goes, "Okay," says, "Now I want you to land the balloon." Now, again, I told you I'm going to cooperate, but I'm not going to see anything I don't see. I'm not going to make anything up. And so nothing happened. And she says, "Well, I land the balloon." And we went through this probably a dozen times about land the balloon. And she said, "There's a control over your head. Reach up and pull the control, land the balloon." Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. And I'm at about the 10th or 12th time of doing it, I thought, this is what it is. People are just tired. Because by that time, I was kind of tired. I'm sitting there. She had an unbelievably hard couch. That was the hardest couch I ever. She'd often want people to stay longer an hour. My buttocks were hurting. My back was starting to hurt. And I can understand now why people would make up stories that want to get out of there. But again, I was not going to. So I just stepped aside. I didn't see anything. I told her, I'm sorry, nothing's happening.
Well, in a few minutes after our break, which will be on shortly, we're going to discuss that maybe you were a little bit deeper into it than you thought. Now we'll take our break.
It is the 15th century. El Tesoro de Cielo, a Spanish treasure ship, sends a scouting expedition to a strange island. Golden statues surrounding them prove the enormity of their find. Suddenly, hordes of ghoulish creatures with scaly green flesh and skeletal wings descend upon them from the sky.
What do you think of this, Rufio?
These creatures are fragile, Captain. We can take them with our swords.
They seem supernatural. Who knows what powers they possess?
Fallen angels, weakened by their treason.
My God! Are you saying they're Nephilim, the devil's host?
I'm saying, whatever they are, we can take them. Do any of you cowards dare join me?
Up against sharp knife-like nails and hideous fangs, the men's swords rip into slimy green flesh. Though black blood pours copiously from their half-naked bodies, the creatures miraculously persist. Can the crew survive this bloody, cursed battle?
Find out more by Googling The Thrice Born, a new sci-fi supernatural novel by Carlos Lopez Avery and Johnny Bluestar. Google with the words Carlos Johnny Kendall, The Thrice Born. That's Carlos Johnny Kendall, The Thrice Born.
New Galaxy Enterprises is a media company specializing in wide-ranging content like novels, nonfiction books, screenplays, commercial advertising, web content, etc. One of our most esteemed providers is illustrator Robert W. Zalo. I work on all my most important projects like book covers, logos, web design elements with Robert. As an illustrator, he worked on the Ignatz-nominated comic book, The Expert's Guide to Killing Things That Go Bump in the Night. His skills encompass advertising, magazine illustrations, gaming, comic books, TV production, and scenic painting. His clients include Comcast, Adelphia, Haven Talent, ForceWorks, High Octane Theater, Star Creative Advertising. If you wish to contact Robert, go to JohnnyBlueStar.com and let me know. That's JohnnyBlueStar.com. For artist, illustrator Robert Zalo, an essential component of all the work we do. Maybe he can help you too. If you like Threshold Radio, a program which deals with core issues affecting our personal, political, and spiritual lives, and advocates the creation of an enlightened, informed citizenry, not only in America, but throughout the world, then you might think of supporting both your product and business and our message by advertising on our show. All programs are archived and are supported in various ways, including social media, our outreach being broadcast weekly on VegasAllNetRadio.com, a very advanced internet broadcasting station, but also archived directly on our websites on YouTube and in SoundCloud. We believe in time we will have a very broad outreach. Through New Galaxy Enterprises, our parent company, we can create a wide range of marketing and advertising components to complement your advertising on Threshold Radio and increase your outreach in many creative and exciting ways. If interested, just go to www.thresholdradio.com and fill out a contact form with your interest. That's www.thresholdradio.com.
We're back with Robert Snow, author of Portrait of a Past Life Skeptic, a former homicide detective who suddenly plunged into a rather important, I believe, investigation of the past lifetime experience. I think the one thing about your regression that amazed me, Robert, and in fact correlated with some of my experience, was your description of yourself when you, quote, woke up, so to speak, in another body in another time. Owing to one important but unique experience in my life, I woke up in a dream, in a world that was every bit as vivid and real as the one I lived in, and knowing I was full well in another room sleeping. This changed my life and perspective permanently. So I wasn't skeptical when I said when I heard you say you saw yourself in an entirely different environment, because I've experienced something like that yourself, not with a past lifetime though. In this case, you were in an entirely different body in a world quite different than ours. In your book, you said, quote, however, what really set this experience apart was that I had control of it. I could look around. This wasn't like a dream in which whatever events were occurring controlled what I saw and where my attention was drawn. I could control this experience. I could decide where I wanted to look and what I wanted to look at and what. And while most dreams have some type of action going on that propels the plot, in this case, nothing was happening other than a light breeze blowing. I was simply standing alone in a beautiful valley. There was nothing else happening. It occurred to me that this was like some kind of virtual reality game, except that the landscape didn't have a cartoon feel to it. Instead, it looked vividly realistic. But I realized, like virtual reality, it only looked as if the world I found myself standing in was genuine, while I knew it really wasn't. In my mind, I may have thought I was standing in a valley. I may have thought I could feel the breeze in my face. However, I knew it was just a trick brought on by the hypnosis. And that's an example of the fascinating.
You meet her. So I met this woman on the street. We went to this little sidewalk cafe, and she asked me, what do you order? I said, she orders some kind of special water. I order a glass of wine. She said, okay. She said, now go to the next scene. She said, she'd always say, like, go 5 years ahead. Go 5 years to the next scene. So so again, there's a little gray fog after that sidewalk cafe, and I'm in a hallway of like an apartment building. And I have an argument with a woman who I told Dr. Griffin was my wife. We're having some kind of argument. I don't know what the argument's about. We're having an argument. But I just turn and walk away, and I walk down the hallway into another room. And it's an artist studio. It's got a gigantic, the whole roof is a skylight, and one wall is all windows. And there are just dozens of paintings hanging around everywhere. And again, I didn't know this place. Bob Snow didn't know this place, but the person the body I was in did. I told Dr. Griffin, this is where I work. I paint portraits. I told her I paint portraits. I hate painting portraits. I said that 3 or 4 times. I hate painting portraits, but I need the money. This is where I work.
And money was a very important thing to this.
It's funny.
Individual.
You could feel as this person, it was like a driving force for this person. I kept telling her, I need the money, but I don't like painting portraits, but I need the money.
And this is quite different than your perception of yourself in this lifetime. This is a completely different character because you had a steady job and you had a side job as a writer, and this was not. You were more in a regular place that ordinary people are who have a steady income, right?
Yeah, I didn't. Bob Snow wasn't experiencing any of this, but the body I was in was experiencing it. And I could feel this body. It was almost a desperation of this person about money, about and about not liking to paint portraits. But the walls were covered with all kind of paintings. A lot of them were portraits. And apparently, he hadn't been able to sell a lot of them.
Well, we're going to go back to this lifetime in just a few minutes, but right now we're going to talk about a little bit about someone named Patty Greer.
Patty Greer journeyed to England to investigate crop circles, eventually becoming a filmmaker, chronicling this phenomena and serving as a kind of intermediary between the unknown creators and a humanity on the brink of global disaster. Hear her complete story by visiting Show 1, Patty Greer, Crop Circle Mysteries, in our Threshold Radio archives in Vegas, allnetradio.com, and YouTube. Here's one of her songs.
Are you the one gonna set my heart free? Are you the one gonna take me? Baby, now I know my heart and I feel these feelings. Do you really wanna know? Take me deep into your heart. Show me. Are you the one gonna dance me round till the morning comes? Are you the one gonna let me be your only one? Show me tricks that I've never seen. Let me be the queen of your life. Right now, take me.
The following is from West Side Warrior, the memoir of Ray Boylan, a Korean War veteran and crime fighter. He was there fighting in the world's coldest battlefield when the Chinese communists invaded.
Desperate squad members ran past our foxhole yelling, "Get the hell out of here, there's too many of them." Again, we saw the Chinese soldiers charging in with opium-induced mindlessness, oblivious of our bullets. Again, we heard the bugles and whistles. Climbing out of our foxhole, Bob dropped 2 hand grenades behind us, and I threw one over my shoulder. Bullets whizzing by our heads, Bob and I became bolts of lightning flashing across the mountainside. Like a hideous film, desperate scenes like this played out on the Tokong Pass for 3 days. Sometimes I played in the scene. Sometimes I could only watch and wonder if it were real, or if I'd be suddenly jolted out of my trance by an RKO usher saying, "Hey, did you kids sneak in here?"
To acquire this book, Google westsidewarrior.boylan.kindle. Boylan is spelled Boylan. That's Westside Warrior, Boylan, Kindle.
We're back with Robert Snow, author of Portrait of a Past Lifetime Skeptic and former homicide detective with the Indianapolis Police Department, telling us about his first regression experience into past lifetimes. And one thing about this, Robert, about the we're going to get much more into the artist's life, but let's talk about for a second his death as guided by the hypnotist.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Griffin, again, I went to a couple more scenes of this person's life. I was at a party where a bunch of people were congratulating me. I didn't know what for, but I was the star of the party. They were congratulating me. I went to a scene where I was walking through a gigantic garden. I was really depressed. Again, I didn't know what I was depressed about. No, I just knew this person was. So finally, Dr. Griffin said, "Okay, I want you to go to your death." Because it turns out, apparently, after I found out later, I guess in any life, the death is the most important moment because you kind of review your life and see what you did accomplish and didn't accomplish. So She said, "Go to your death." So I saw myself laying in bed, and I saw myself die. And then I saw myself racing out of the body and going through a roof. But again, at the time, I thought, everybody's seen ghost stories. Everybody knows what happened. You die, you go out of the body, and I saw myself passing through this roof, and that wasn't anything amazing. But it's funny, and again, I started talking, didn't know what I was going to say, and I told Dr. Griffin, she asked me, what did you regret about this life? And I said, I regret we didn't have any children because my wife couldn't have children. And I didn't know I was going to say that, but I said it. So I rise out of the body, and I'm over the top of a large city, a huge city. You can see lights for miles in all directions. And Dr. Griffith says, go into the light. And there's a light up above me, a bright light. But it's interesting because people seem to think when you're hypnotized that you're under the control of the hypnotist. They make you get up. You've probably seen these stage hypnotists that make people get up and cluck like chickens and stuff. Well, that's not true, because when you're in hypnotism, you're still in control. Because Dr. Griffith said, go to the light, and I didn't. Instead, I saw myself flying through some woods, and I could tell that it looked like it was late fall. It wasn't quite winter yet because the trees still had leaves, but it looked like it was a really cold, brisk night, a fall night. So anything, I'm flying through this woods, and all of a sudden I come out. I'm looking in the window on the second or third floor of this big mansion. And in my room, there's a big fire in the fireplace. Nobody's in the room, but there's a big fire in the fireplace, and there's a painting over the fireplace. And I told Dr. Griffith, I wanted to see one of my paintings before I left this life. I wanted to see one of my paintings one more time. And over the fireplace was a still life. It had a bottle and some fruit and a big sun in it. And I told her I wanted to again see my painting one more time before I died. And I thought that was kind of interesting, only to show that the hypnotist is really not in charge of the hypnotic session. Because again, she told me she would tell me to do things, and if I wanted to do them, I would. If I didn't, I wouldn't. So it was kind of funny. Yeah.
Well, now one of your experiences during this time took place in the body of a woman, a Greek girl. This actually occurred between the two separate past life visits to the artist that we're talking about in your first hypnotic regression, who turned out to be your last lifetime. What kind of a shock was it for a hard-boiled homicide detective to recognize their lifetime as a woman?
Well, it's kind of funny because after I went into the light as the artist, Dr. Griffith said, okay, so I want you to go back to a life when you were a female. And I kind of almost brought about laughing. And I thought this is going to be the deal buster. I thought this is going to show this is all phony. I mean, how could I do that? I mean, this is all make-believe and subconscious. How could I do that? So I thought it was kind of funny. I again, almost laughed. So anyway, again, you go in the gray fog, and a whole 3 or 4 seconds later, I come out, and I'm standing in some more woods. But it's not the valley. It's a level woods. I'm standing in front of this big look like marble or limestone monument. And I look down, and it's a woman's body. And at the time, I'm completely confused at the time. I'm thinking, where could this come from? Then you think, well, maybe, there's been movies about men dressing up as women. Tom Hanks had his first TV program like that. There was some call it hot, some like a hot type thing with, Tony Curtis. I thought that's all this is. You see movies for men dressed like women. This has to be where this is coming from. And that's the only way. That's the only thing it could be. I couldn't imagine how else it could be. So we go. So anyway, so she asked about my life, and I had a life as an altar girl in ancient Greece. This is in ancient Greece, and I go through this life in ancient Greece as a young woman. I thought it was still kind of interesting. It was bizarre at that moment. Needless to say, being in a woman's body was very bizarre. But again, I still didn't think it was anything but the hypnotism. So we go through the life as a Greek woman, but I have it was kind of a sad life where you had to be a virgin to work at this temple. Well, apparently I violated that and had a child, and they got rid of me. And I turned out and I gave my child up to go on about my own type thing. And so anyway, so I finally went to my death as a Greek one. So I thought was really, that was the only scary part of the whole regression, is that when the woman died, she'd gone to a village where it was next to a big, either a sea or an ocean, and she died she drowned in a fishing accident, got caught in a net and drowned. And I could taste salt water. As she was dying, I could taste salt water. It was kind of frightening for a few moments. Unfortunately, Dr. Griffith, the guy who could see this and got me out of this life, she said, okay. She said, Bob, I want you to go back to your most recent past lives. Go back to the life you lived before you were Bob Snow. And I was really kind of glad to get out of this life as a woman. Not only for the drowning, but I had felt this tremendous guilt about giving my daughter up. I went back and gave my daughter to the temple so she could work at the temple like I had. So because I knew it'd be easier for me to get on with my life if I didn't have a child with me. Well, I felt this tremendous guilt. And I remember at the time thinking how stupid this was, because this is all make-believe. Why would you feel guilty? It's make-believe. But
well, in the next hour, we're going to go into many more details of your investigation. But right now, we're going to go out with a little bit of music by Edgar Ahrens, a Russian composer I've worked with. And this is a piece that a short piece called I'll Go With You. And we'll be right back with Robert Snow and a thorough investigation of his past life experience. This is Johnny Bluestar. Welcome to Threshold, a global media event. Is the universe just a random dance of atoms, or is it a manifestation of a supremely intelligent architect? Can its purpose, or our purpose here on Earth, be adequately assessed? Can we commune with it, know its intentions, cooperate with its direction? Here, we define threshold as a gateway state of awareness, allowing mankind to cross into a place of real cognition. Threshold allows us to approach questions of higher reality through the door of experience, rather than mere belief. Welcome to Threshold, where we tear away the veil from commercial media, bringing our audience and participants into another realm of reality and enhanced communication. This is Johnny Bluestar. We're back with Robert Snow, a homicide police detective at the time, who after an hypnotic regression became embroiled in another type of investigation involving death, and yes, rebirth into another body, his own. In his first attempted regression with a professional hypnotist, although profoundly skeptical, he found himself transported to a world as real and vivid as this world, only in a different realm of time. The last time being focused in the late 1800s, where he seemed to be an artist. At this point, although he had certain details, he didn't even know the artist's name. Tell me, Robert, when did investigating this become such an obsession, if you like, and eventually almost an absolute commitment?
Well, actually, I went way back to life the second time. Dr. Griffith told me, he said, I want you to go back to the life you lived before you're a Bob Snow. Go back to the last time you're on, before you come for this life. So, there was a couple of moments of gray fog, and all of a sudden I was back in the body, and I could tell I was back in the artist's body again, because I was painting a portrait at that moment. Oh. And but the interesting part was my subject, my portrait was a hunchback woman. And I thought how bizarre that was at the moment. They were doing a portrait of a hunchback woman. Sure. But the interesting part was, again, this regression was so vivid, I could see every single brushstroke. And I could see I was just finishing the portrait. So I would talk to Dr. Griffith, and again, I'm telling Dr. Griffith I'm painting a portrait. I hate painting portraits, but I need the money, and on and on. So then Dr. Griffith took me to a couple more episodes in this life. But finally, when she told me, she says, I want you to go to 5 years ahead in life. So again, I'm in the gray fog. And again, just before I knew I was going to say anything, all of a sudden I just started talking. I said, she died of a blood clot. The doctor said she died of a blood clot. Now, I had no idea who I was talking about. I had no idea. I'm just talking. I didn't know I was going to talk. But I knew whoever it was, this was a woman supremely important to this artist. I mean, just because I wanted to cry. I could feel myself. I could feel a sob come down. And I thought how bizarre that was. I could feel a sob come up. But anyway, after I said this, the recorder I had brought along shut off. It'd be a loud click. I had a 60-minute tape, and I opened my eyes, and that was it. That was the end. That was the end of the regression. So now I'm feeling kind of foolish because I'd gone in there all cocksure about what was going to happen. Now I'd kind of babbled the last half hour. I feel like an idiot. So Dr. Grimm, what does this all mean? Can you see us relationship? Really, at the moment, I was too confused. I was certainly confused about the whole.
Another world, right?
I still thought this is. I'm sorry, I still didn't believe it.
I mean, your experience was something completely out of the ordinary for your own background, right?
I did supernatural. I believed it myself. So anyway, but there are for a little bit, and I'm thinking it didn't have the foundation of something you just made up. Everything was so clear and vivid. It had the feel of a real story. But you're figuring, you're trying to figure what could this be, But I finally told myself, Bob, just forget about it. This was simply memories for your subconscious mind. You're hypnotized. When you're hypnotized, you can actually delve into your subconscious mind. That's all it was. It's memories from this life. Let it go. And I kept telling myself that. But for the next couple of weeks, that's all I'd think about. All I could think about was this regression. And it's funny, for the first couple of years after the regression, if I closed my eyes, I could still see it just as clear as I was there. I could still see that painting with every brush stroke in it. I could still see the scene very clear. So probably for the next couple of weeks, I would think about it, dozens of times every day. I'd think about it all the time, constantly. And it started bugging me because I could feel myself becoming obsessed about this. And as a police officer, believe me, I've dealt with people who have obsessions, and seldom does it turn out good for the person. And I could feel myself becoming obsessed about this regression. I thought, this is stupid. I kept telling myself, Bob, this is stupid. This is nothing but your subconscious mind. Bring up old memories, reorient them, and put them into a story that looks like a real story, but it's not. And no matter how many times I told myself that, and just forget about it, I couldn't. I kept thinking about it. Finally, I could see I was becoming obsessed. I knew I needed to do something about it because, again, obsessions very seldom turn out to be good. I decided, what I need to do? I need to find one of these two paintings I'd seen. Because I did that time. I didn't have any names of anybody or anything like that. But I had seen two paintings, and I figured, how many paintings of hunchback women could there be? I figured, what you need to do is find either this one or the still life. When you see them, then you'll remember where you saw these paintings. Not in a past life. You saw them somewhere in this life. You probably read a little blurb about the artist, and that's where all this stuff come from. So I said,
I think it's better for the hunchback than the still life because you'd have a lot to look
still life.
at.
I thought, I thought, how many hunchback women could have portraits made? Come on, I thought that'd should be easy to find. So I made this plan. I was going to go to the Indianapolis Public. This was, by the way, this was back in 1992. So this was before the internet. So in those days, when you wanted to do research, you couldn't just pull up a search engine and type something in. You had to actually go to the library and pull books off the shelf.
I remember.
So I would go to the library. I'd go to their art section, start thumbing through art books. I mean, how hard? I figured it'd take me a couple hours. I would find either one of the two paintings. It'd all come back to me. Everything would be explained. But like a lot of the best laid plans in the world, it didn't work out like I thought. Actually, the Indianapolis Public Library has hundreds and hundreds of art books. I had no idea they had so many. And it took me several months. But I finally went through every single art book in the Indianapolis Public Library. And I didn't find either painting.
There was another part of it besides the obsession and search for the paintings, because you speak about your memories of the session being particularly vivid, but even after it was over, you had some very interesting dreams related to past lifetimes, including some of yourself and your brother Fred working together in a studio painting and also in an art gallery. An artist colony. In one dream, you talk to a little man who tells you something about your mutual past lifetimes. Why do you suppose all that extra stuff is happening too?
See, again, I thought at the time, this is all part of the obsession. This thing has got a hold of me. I thought the dreams, because again, I have a dream constantly about something about the regression. Again, like I saw my brother and I, we were painters working together. I saw my stepdaughter as my daughter in the Greek woman's life, and again, I thought this is all just part of the obsession. That's all it is. It's no real. Dreams are just dreams. There's no reality to them. That's what I kept telling myself. It's all part of the obsession. I need to find one of these paintings. Then once you find it and realize, oh yeah, I saw it 6 years ago at an art exhibition. It's all solved. Everything is solved. There's no mystery. There's nothing supernatural. And so that's why I started my research. And after I couldn't find it at the library, I started going to bookstores around the city. I thought, because a lot of times the bookstores had art books that the library didn't have. I went to every book I could find, all the bookstores in Indianapolis. Nothing. So I finally was like, well, okay, maybe I need to talk to some art dealers. So I started going to art galleries and art dealers. I figured, surely God, they'd know about a Hunchback Woman painting, wouldn't they? But I found out something interesting. In 1992, 90, and 93, at that time, there was no internet and there was no central list of paintings anywhere. In other words, if you didn't know where a painting was, who had it, there was really not hardly any way of finding it. And so after about 2 or 3 months of investigation, an intense investigation, I was doing this every my lunch hour and evenings, on weekends. I didn't find anything. Hadn't found a thing.
So at one point, you actually went back for another regression experience, right?
Well, I thought after a couple months of finding nothing, I thought, well, maybe I need more information on the artist. Maybe I should go back and for another regression, go back. Maybe I could find a name or something like that would give me some more information. Then I could find the paintings and remember where I saw them this life. So I went back to Griffith for a second, which wasn't easy after the first time. I was still embarrassed in the first one, but I went back and had a second. And interesting enough, even though I went back to several past lives, I could not get to the artist life. Every time she'd tell me to go to the artist life, nothing would happen.
And later on, you actually went into your own experiments with self-hypnosis, and you did come up with one thing, didn't you?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like I said, Dr. Griffith asked her, I got down with the second session, I asked her, why couldn't I go back to the artist life? She says, you already know everything you need to know, which later on turned out to be true. At the time, I thought, well, I don't know why it's not true. So finally, what happened, I even visited a New Age bookstore in Indianapolis here. I want to get information on past lives, maybe to find out what happened so I can understand where this information came from. And I found some like scripts and a couple of audio tapes that you could do self-hypnosis, which, by the way, turns out to be a lot harder than you think it is. Real hard. But I tried that a couple of times. Actually, I tried about half a dozen times. And only, I think, twice I found myself going into the state I had been in Dr. Griffith's office. But it's funny, it only lasted for a few seconds. Then I would see the number 1917 and be like an explosion, and you'd be out of it. It happened to me twice, but I never could go very deep into it.
Well, we're going to take a break now, but when we get back, we're going to tell our audience the most astounding thing that happened in a little city called New Orleans. And so we'll be right back. Patricia Welch is clearly one of the most accomplished singers living today. Recently, she created a wonderful CD set called Great Entertaining, Cocktails, Dinner, and Dessert with Patricia. We have 2 complete shows with Patricia, show number 4, Evolution of a Singer, and show number 14, Cocktails with Patricia. You can find them at our Threshold Radio archives at vegasallnetradio.com and YouTube. Here's one of her songs. This is Johnny Bluestar. I've worked as a lyricist with Patricia Welch for over 5 years, along with Russian composer Edgar Ahrens, a friend and colleague.
Her ability as a singer is simply amazing. She brings a unique and dramatic flair to every song she sings. Over the next few months, we shall be releasing a number of these songs, part of an album called Hadley's Castle. Meanwhile, Patricia has been busy creating a super enjoyable collection of classic standards in an exciting 46-song, 3-CD collection.
Music for great entertaining introduces Cocktails, Dinner, and Dessert with Patricia Welch. 3 hours of continuous music. 46 of the all-time classic standards, spanning decades of hit songs. Going to a friend's home for dinner? Cocktails, Dinner, and Dessert with Patricia also makes the perfect hostess gift. This 3-CD compilation is the perfect background music that sets just the right mood for any dinner party.
I'm crazy for feeling so lonely. There was a boy, a very strange, enchanted boy.
To purchase this album, just go to patriciawelch.com/CD. That is patriciawelch.com/CD. You won't be disappointed.
It is the 15th century. El Tesoro de Cielo, a Spanish treasure ship, sends a scouting expedition to a strange island. Golden statues surrounding them prove the enormity of their find. Suddenly, hordes of ghoulish creatures with scaly green flesh and skeletal wings descend upon them from the sky.
What do you think of this, Rufio?
These creatures are fragile, Captain. We can take them with our swords.
They seem supernatural. Who knows what powers they possess?
Fallen angels, weakened by their treason.
My God! Are you saying they're Nephilim, the devil's host?
I'm saying, whatever they are, we can take them. Do any of you cowards dare join me?
Up against sharp knife-like nails and hideous fangs, the men's swords rip into slimy green flesh. Though black blood pours copiously from their half-naked bodies, the creatures miraculously persist. Can the crew survive this bloody, cursed battle?
Find out more by Googling The Thrice Born, a new sci-fi supernatural novel by Carlos Lopez Avery and Johnny Bluestar. Google with the words Carlos Johnny Kendall, The Thrice Born. That's Carlos Johnny Kendall, The Thrice Born.
We're back with retired police officer Robert Snow. In our discussion, we are relating what happened to him and how at some point his investigation with a supposed past lifetime he experienced as an artist while under hypnosis was beginning to give him trouble. And I guess, didn't you sort of quit for a while? Didn't you sort of say, that's it?
Yeah, well, after several months, I couldn't find anything on this thing. And like I said, when I was in charge of homicide, we had an 83% clearance rate. But that still means 17% of your murders go unsolved. And because simply you don't have enough evidence to follow through on. And that's what I thought this case was. I just don't have enough evidence. I'm just going to forget about it. And I tried to. I didn't have much luck, and I still thought about it all the time. But anyway, so it was getting close to my wife and I's anniversary, and we were talking about taking a trip somewhere. And she called me one day at work and said, what do you think about going to New Orleans? All right, sounds like fun. I've never been there. She'd never been there. So we booked a trip to New Orleans, and we flew down there for our anniversary, and we had a really good time, and look around New Orleans and all the stuff we did. And anyway, the last day, our plane didn't leave till late in the afternoon, so we had most of the day in New Orleans. We decided to kind of window shop in the French Quarter. They have a lot of really neat stores and shops there and everything. So we were doing that. We were window shopping, looking around, and we finally got down to Royal Street. In the early 1990s, Royal Street at that time was mostly art galleries. And we started going through the art galleries, and they had some beautiful paintings and, by very well-known artists and everything. But I noticed as I'm walking down the street, Royal Street, that the galleries are getting smaller and the paintings getting more obscure. And we finally got to the very end of Royal Street, and there's a little art gallery. We go into it. It's 2-story, and it said modern art on the second floor. My wife likes modern art. I never have. So she goes to the second floor. And I walk along the first floor of the thing, look at the paintings. I don't recognize any of the paintings. I don't recognize any of the artists, but I'm just looking at everything. So I get to the corner and start to go, and there's a portrait hanging out, standing on the easel in the corner. So I turn, and I glance, and I walk by, and kind of like I walked into a glass wall. Because I spun around, and it was the portrait of the hunchback woman. Now,
Wow.
I was a police officer for a lot of years, and I've been involved in a lot of scary situations where I've been frightened a number of times. I don't think I've ever been quite as frightened as I was at this moment. Only because as a police officer, even if you're in frightening, scary situations, you have training, you have experience, and you know what your best action should be and what the actions that other people are going to be. And so you feel a little confident. But this case, I had no experience, no training. I didn't know what to do. I turned around and I stared, and I looked, and it was for a moment. It was so surreal. I kind of wondered, am I really here? Am I really here? Maybe I'm in a nursing home somewhere. I'm in a nursing home or a hospital. I've had a stroke, and I just thought this is a hallucination, because things like this might happen on the X-Files. It might happen in movie and TVs. Things like this don't happen to people in real life. They just don't happen. Then I kept staring at the portrait. I kept telling myself, no, this looks like it's close, but it's not the same one. So I closed my eyes, and I could still see the regression. I could see the painting, and I opened my eyes, and it was the same painting. It was simply, and so I stood there for some minute. I didn't know what to do. I don't think I've ever been quite that frightened, even when I was a police officer, because again, the problem was I had no experience, nothing to work with. What do you do in this situation? Here's a painting that I saw in a regression. I've been hunting for months, couldn't find anything, and to stumble on it by accident in a city 1,000 miles from home. What are the odds of that happening? They're astronomical. So
it makes you think that maybe it wasn't an accident.
Well, yeah, later it did. At the moment I did. At the moment I'm trying to find some rational reason for this. There's got to be some rational explanation for this. There just has to be. And I just kept staring. So anyway, I kept staring at the painting. And apparently one of the salesmen thought, hot dog, he figured I had a sale here, see? So after a couple minutes of me just sitting, staring at this painting, trying to figure out what am I going to do? What is this, what's going on? The salesman over and said, hey, I bet you're thinking how nice I look over your fireplace, aren't you? And kind of startled me out of it a moment. And so I thought, okay, fine, Bob, but whatever happened, you need to find out about this painting, find out the artist. So I asked the dealer, I said, gee, I don't recognize the painting of the artist. Who painted this? He said, hold on a second. He said, I got a little bio here. So he goes over to this desk and he pulls out a piece of paper and it's got a little bio, and it said, painting was J. Carroll Beckwith. And interesting enough, it said he was born 1852, died in 1917. And of course, the minute I seen that, there's like electric shock run through you, because I remember the self-hypnosis, the number 1917. And I thought, Bob, quit it. You're being silly. You're trying to find stuff that's not there. So I read the bio, and immediately I saw there were 5 things in the bio that matched my regression. And again, it's one of these things where, I'm so stunned, I don't know what to do. But then I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know what this is. You've seen this painting somewhere in this life. You read a little bio about the artist at the bottom. This is where it's all coming from. There's nothing supernatural. I mean, finding the painting in New Orleans was one heck of a coincidence, extraordinary coincidence, but there's nothing supernatural. So I told the dealer, I said, hey, I've seen this painting somewhere before. He says, has it been in an exhibition in a museum somewhere? He said, no. He said, let me be honest. He said, this painting's been in a private collection for years and years. He said, let me be honest with you. He said, Beckwith wasn't that famous, so I can let this go pretty cheap. But anyway, so unfortunately, I didn't know what to say. I'm just so flustered and stunned. I didn't know what to do. Fortunately, that moment, my wife came down from upstairs and asked me ready to go. And so I mumbled something to the dealer about it, let me think about it, and we left. But the good thing was, when we left, I thought, well, now I have information. I have a name. I have dates of birth and dates of death. I can go back to Indianapolis. I can research J. Carroll Beckwith. Then I'll find out where I saw him in this life. I mean, this all is one heck of a coincidence. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. But I could live with that if I could just explain to myself where I had seen him in this life.
Well, one of the interesting things when I heard an interview with you before was that I used to actually work in an art gallery on Royal Street in New Orleans. But that was quite some time before you came there. But New Orleans is a very magical place anyway, and I had some really interesting experiences there. Now, after your initial shock at finding the Hunchback painting and the artist's name and bio was over with, and you realized you could not actually have seen this painting before with the recognition of the incredible odds that you mentioned, did you at all feel at this point that maybe there was, or even speculate that there was some kind of intelligent guidance that you never knew existed before?
No. No, I was still convinced this time there was a rational, down-there explanation for this. I just had to find it. So I went back to Indianapolis, and I went to the public library, and I started doing research on this J. Carroll Beckwith. And interesting enough, the librarian helped me. There wasn't hardly anything on him. I mean, the small books on an artist was nothing. The very, very large book on an artist, there'd be maybe a couple sentences about him. He was a portrait painter who lived in New York in the late 1800s, early 1900s, never painted any painting of significance. He made his living painting portraits. But interesting enough, you know, that's what concerned me was, if there's this little about him, how could I have stumbled information about him? And I mean, there was hardly anything about him. But anyway, so the librarian there at the public library told me, says, "I tell you what you need to do." She said, "Why don't you go up to the art museum library? They have a much more extensive art library up there. They do much more art research." So I thought, good idea. So I drove up north side of Indianapolis to the art museum, went to their library, and told the librarian that I was researching J. Carroll Beckwith. And so she found me some more information about him. Not a whole lot more, maybe another, couple paragraphs or two. But the interesting part was every little bit I found kept substantiating something I'd seen in the regression, little small points about like I found a thing in the art museum said that he painted portraits but hated painted portraits. And I remember saying that to Dr. Griffith type thing. And I kept finding one little point after another. It was really I didn't know what to do. I kept looking for something that was wrong, something that wasn't true. Then I could say, well, see, this is all baloney. But I kept finding one confirmation another. But interesting enough, during one of the books it was actually about the famous painter, American painter, James Singer Sargent, who turned out was he and Beckwith went to art school together and were roommates in Paris for 5 years. And so they said this anecdote, I bet there's a little footnote at the bottom of the book, said this anecdote came from the diaries of J. Carroll Beckwith that are kept on file at the National Academy of Design in New York City.
Well, we're going to find out what happened then in just a couple of minutes. But we're going to take a break now. And here's some information about the incredible compositional artistry of my friend and colleague, Russian composer Edgar Ahrens. I've worked with Russian composer Edgar Ahrens for quite a few years, building an inventory of songs, many of which feature singer-performer Patricia Welch. We will soon be releasing these songs, components of an album and a musical in progress called Hadley's Castle. When Edgar and I first got together, I was amazed by the brilliance of his musical scores created for movies, TVs, and animations. Here is a sample of the work he did on the Russian TV series, available now on Amazon, called The Secret Agent's Memoir, which had 2 seasons. This score is called Escape and was created for the first season. I am very pleased to say that Bridge of Light Productions, a division of New Galaxy Enterprises, is proud to be the contact point for television and film companies seeking information about this amazing composer's work. If you're in the entertainment business and wish to know more, contact me at johnnybluestar@gmail.com. That's johnnybluestar@gmail.com.
The following is from West Side Warrior, the memoir of Ray Boylan, a Korean War veteran and crime fighter. He was there fighting in the world's coldest battlefield when the Chinese communists invaded.
Desperate squad members ran past our foxhole yelling, "Get the hell out of here, there's too many of them!" Again, we saw the Chinese soldiers charging in with opium-induced mindlessness, oblivious of our bullets. Again, we heard the bugles and whistles. Climbing out of our foxhole, Bob dropped 2 hand grenades behind us, and I threw one over my shoulder. Bullets whizzing by our heads, Bob and I became bolts of lightning flashing across the mountainside. Like a hideous film, desperate scenes like this played out on the Tokong Pass for 3 days. Sometimes I played in the scene. Sometimes I could only watch and wonder if it were real, or if I'd be suddenly jolted out of my trance by an RKO usher saying, "Hey, did you kids sneak in here?"
To acquire this book, Google westsidewarrior.boylan.kindle. Boylan is spelled Boylan. That's Westside Warrior, Boylan, Kindle.
My company, New Galaxy Enterprises, is a California corporation specializing in the creation of media and promotional content. We are focused on original, innovative projects that are good for humanity. These projects could be nonfiction books or novels, fictional screenplays or documentary content, websites and website content, commercial advertising content for print, audio, or video products on the internet, television, or radio, musical scores for advertising, television, or film, video, audio editing, etc. We want to promote products and projects that support the environment, encourage a healthy experience in living, developing, nurturing, and useful technology, and offering platforms for positive, socially constructive entertainment or informative, transformative media. Our experience in creating a variety of products like this is rather vast, and we offer client-based and collaborative products, as well as the opportunity of active investors to join us in the creation and promotion of proprietary products, some of which are in latter stages of development. For more information, go to www.newgalaxyenterprises.com. That's www.newgalaxyenterprises.com. If you're interested in talking to us, just fill out the contact sheet and we will get back with you.
Hi, this is Johnny Bluestar back on Threshold Radio with Robert Snow, a retired Indianapolis homicide detective and commander of their division, and also a author of something called Portrait of a Past Lifetime Skeptic. And at this point, Robert went to the Central Library in Indianapolis, and he didn't find everything that he wanted, but was suggested to go to the Indianapolis Museum Library, and there he began to get a few more clues. And also he found a book by John Singer Sargent which contained references to something that was very interesting, evidentially. What did you find there?
Well, again, the footnote said that this anecdote about Sargent came from the diaries of J. Carroll Beckwith, which were at the National Academy of Design. Another footnote said that this anecdote came from the unpublished autobiography of J. Carroll Beckwith, also at the Academy of Design. So I realized at that point I had already verified about 10 points I had seen in the regression. It was starting to really bug me. So what I was, tell you the truth, what I was looking for at this point wasn't more verification. I was looking for one or two things I had said during the regression that weren't true. I thought if I could find one or two things about Beckwith that weren't true, I had said weren't true, that means it's not a real memory then. This is some kind of messed up thing. It's not true. So that's what I was really searching for. So what I did is I actually sent a letter to National Academy of Design, asked if I could see the diaries. And they said, well, we don't loan them out. They're too fragile. But they are on microfilm that you could order through interlibrary loan. So I did that. I asked an interlibrary loan for his diaries. Well, they came, and I got kind of a shock when I took them to the microfilm and opened up. He kept his diary from age 19 up to the day before he died at age 65. Over 17,000 pages of diary. So,
don't you think that maybe in some way, considering that much of writing, that he was kind of a writer too himself?
Yeah,
maybe
he
not
did.
Professional, but he was into writing.
He very much was. Actually, at the end of his life, matter of fact, when he was really sick, he couldn't paint any longer. He was sick and couldn't stand up. He decided to become a writer, and he actually had several things published in writing magazines. But anyway, so I look at this 17,000 pages, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I mean, you could have it for 2 weeks, but how are you going to go to 17,000 pages? You can't.
That's like For War and Peace by Tolstoy or something.
Exactly. So after a couple times of trying to find stuff in there, I looked at some of the tapes, and but I couldn't go deep into them. I eventually ended up having hard copy made of the 17,000 pages. I had it made into hard copy, and it took me over a year. At every night and the weekend evening, I read every single page of his diary, all 17,000 pages. And now, interesting enough, he also did an autobiography, but he started this in the spring of 1917 when he was sick. He had endocarditis, which is infection of the heart valves, which makes you very weak and sick. And so he only got 20 pages done on that, so there wasn't much value to that. So again, what I'm looking through in his diary, I'm looking for the one or two things that are not true. For example, I told Dr. Griffith that what I regret about the life is that we didn't have children because my wife couldn't have children. I thought, well, if he had children, then that's it, isn't it? Then this is all some kind of gobbled up mess. It's not true. So I started looking, and I'd seen him drinking wine. I thought, well, both he's a teetotaler. And I was always under the impression in the late 1800s that men who drink whiskey. They didn't drink wine. I thought if they didn't drink wine, that's fine. I had said that a woman very important to him, died of a blood clot. I thought, well, if nobody very important to die of blood clot, again, this is all garbage. This is not true, not real. So again, I started going through the diary. But like with the little facts of the library, rather than find the fact it wasn't true, I kept finding one little thing after another that was true. For example, I had saw him, when I described him, Dr. Griffith, I'd seen him with a fancy walking stick. I told her it wasn't a cane, it's a fancy walking stick. Well, I found a number of pictures of him with fancy walking stick, and him mentioned in a diary a number of times about the fancy walking stick. And interesting enough, when I got on October 24th, 1888, which coincidentally is 29 years to the day before he died, his wife had a very, very difficult miscarriage. And because of it, she couldn't have children. And interesting enough, he mentioned in his diary a number of times how much he would have loved to have had children, but his wife couldn't have children.
Right.
You know, again, I kept finding one little thing after another. And it wasn't the denying. I kept looking for the one denying fact that I could prove wasn't wrong. And I up to the very last, I was determined I was going to find it. But then I got to December 5th, 1886, and he tells, they were interesting enough before I get into that. Let me tell you, I realized that I told you there were about a woman dying of blood clot. I knew that after reading enough of his diary, that was only two women. His wife, who he loved dearly, and his mother, who he just adored. His mother was the only person who encouraged him to be an artist. His dad had always told him that being an artist is the best way he knew of starving to death. His dad never tried to encourage him to be an artist, but his mother had, and he adored his mother. So I figured it had to be one of those two women. Well, when I got to the diary to December 5th, 1886, he writes that his mother was in church and had a stroke due to a blood clot and died.
Oh.
You know, I think that was the one that kind of pushed me over the edge. I realized then I'm not going to find the denying fact. I'm going to find every fact. As a matter of fact, stepping back a minute, when I ordered the tapes, I thought, well, I'm going to look for the denying factor. So I went through my tape I had made of my regression, and I started listing everything could be proven or not proven. And I found there were 28 things I'd said about this artist's life that could be proved or not proved. Like, say, for example, cause of death, about not having children. There were 28 different things I'd said that could be proved or not proved.
Right.
And so my thought was to find a couple of them that weren't true. In the end, I end up confirming all 28 facts about Beckwith.
And it's just amazing. I mean, can I be honest with you? I mean, it seems to me if you miss two of them, you'd still have a statistical probability that something real had happened, right?
Yeah, I know, but I was not ready to do that. But again, I had lived my life looking for facts and hard evidence. I wasn't looking for supernatural, otherworldly things. I was not willing to accept this unless I had absolute 100% proof. Now, the odds you could, if I had 28 things, the odds you could guess, half dozen of them right, it's not that unusual. You could make them, because like I kept trying to tell myself, okay, I told you that when under my regression, I thought it was late fall when I saw him die. Well, he died October 24th. It was late fall. Okay, I thought, right. But I reasoned to myself, okay, a fourth of people who die every year die in the fall. I had seen him die he was in a large city. I thought, well, awful lot of people die in large cities. This is how I kept trying to rationalize myself. Every fact I found, I kept trying to rationalize. Yeah, okay, I rose above my body above a large city. He died in New York City. But awful lot of people do, not just him. I kept thinking, that doesn't mean anything, Bob. Awful lot of people die in New York City. Awful lot of people die in the fall. And this kind of thing. I kept trying to rationalize every time I'd find something, how that wasn't any proof. It was just something that, okay, it matches it, but it's not necessarily proof. It wasn't until I found the thing about his wife having the miscarriage and not being able to have children, and more than that, his mother dying of blood clot, that really decided for me.
Well, on this program, which is kind of a spiritually oriented program, I've noticed that people, who have these experiences, they're coming often from a place where they're pretty much, it's just an ordinary life. And then suddenly something thrusts them into, well, you could call it the Twilight Zone. And the whole nature of reality starts to change. Tell me, after your first edition was published back in 1999, and you were working as, the commander of this division, I believe, this Homicide Division in the police department, What was the public reaction, and also the reaction of publishers, and especially the reaction of your police department?
Well, I'd got a lot of warning from a lot of people, my wife, my agent, and other people, about if I publish this book, it's going to cause me problems. Because before this, I'd had a dozen or so books published. They were all about police procedure, about SWAT teams, about sex crime investigation, about child abuse, various things police did, very police-oriented, police procedural type books. And my agent and everyone was afraid that if I published this book, no one would take me serious again about writing serious police subjects. My wife was really worried about how the police department would react. How would they, what would they think about it? And unfortunately, both my agent and my wife turned out to be right. It didn't go well either way. It didn't go well at the police department. It didn't go well at my publishers. Actually, it took me 5 years because I was having a book published every year. Before this, as a matter of fact, a couple of years I had 2 books published in 1 year. Then it took me 5 years after the publication of this book before I was able to get another book contract.
Well, how did you do that? I mean, what happened with that?
I think enough time passes, everybody forgets. I think enough time passes, everybody forgets, and you can get back in the game again. I think enough.
Well,
time.
It was certainly a sensation. I didn't read the first edition. I read the last one, but it's certainly sensational. I mean, it's just, the fact is that you check off in the most torturous way all these 28 different points, with all kinds of coincidences leading you to being able to do that in the first place. So was it worth it, considering the effect on your career?
Because actually, it didn't, let me finish up the thing about the police department. It didn't go well there either. Yeah. It really didn't. I mean, police captains are the backbone of any police department. All your chiefs and deputy chiefs, you're not really, that's not your rank. That's an appointed rank. You're actually a captain, and you get appointed to these ranks. And when you get down and they get tired of you, a new administration comes in, you go back to being captain again. And so a police captain is the backbone of the police department. And you're not police. Like my wife told me, maybe you might believe in this, police captains don't go talking about it. She told me, just shut up, take us to the grave with me. Because she had investigated, when I first told my wife about this, she decided to investigate it too, to see, she thought I had read something about Beckwith or found information about it somewhere else. I've just forgot it. And so she actually investigated herself, and she couldn't find anything. But regardless, she told me, just shut up about it, Bob. The police department is not going to take it well. And they didn't. No, they didn't. As a matter of fact, they tried to force me into retirement because of it. Yeah. Because I think they thought this is not something they want when their captains talking about publicly.
Yeah, but you had put so much into that career, and you had been so successful, and then now you're suddenly in a different realm of reality. And it's a reality that's quite detached from ordinary reality, and so people just completely freak out.
Well, the point was, like you said, something did, and that actually finding the Hunchback wasn't the only time during this investigation when information about Beckwith was just literally dumped in my lap, by what looked like a startling coincidence. It happened several times during my investigation. And so, you start looking at things, you think, this is much too important. This information came from somewhere. I didn't know where, but it came from somewhere. Mm-hmm. That obviously, whoever's in charge of the universe wants you to write this book, because I kept finding information just dumped in my lap. I mean, it was real. All of a sudden come out of nowhere, there'd be more information about Beckwith. And it's like, well, Bob, who's ever in charge of the universe wants this book written, wants you to do it. Now, is it going to cost me professionally? And it did. It did cost me professionally at the police department and as a writer. But I felt like the book was important enough that it needed to be published. I really need to tell my story.
I really think that you especially for me, because I think it was worth it just so I could read it. But that's being too selfish. I think everybody should take a look at this book. We'll be back in a minute and conclude our discussion and tell you more about how to get a hold of the book and some of Bob's reflections. Originally, Zave Nathan came here from France, seeking work as an actor and musician in Hollywood. Now he and his wife, Bonnie Blazek, write unusual and impactful songs, often addressing critical issues facing humanity. You can hear their story and some of their exciting music in show number 3 with Zave Nathan and Bonnie Blazek in our Threshold Radio archives in VegasAllNetRadio.com and YouTube. Here is one of their songs.
work all day, you're so tired at night. You wonder why your sex drive is gone. Your TV dinner is waiting for you. You grab the remote and turn on the news. And then your box is telling you what to buy. Television, it must be the way out of this. Television, another life falling out of grace.
Boots in Manhattan is a coming-of-age novel by Ray Boylan and Johnny Bluestar. It is about a young Tom Boots Raymond who grows up in New York in the 1940s who is a member of a street gang.
My friends and I were about to start our own game of stickball when Rabbit Lacey, the head of the Rattlers, came up to us and tried to move in on our game. We were called dwarves, the youngest members of this stupid gang.
Hey, Kevin, I need you to get some gloves and some stuff I left at my place.
No, this is our game.
Hey, are you my good little dwarf or what?
You've been calling me a dwarf since I was 6. We're not your personal slaves, pal.
Hey, what is this? A dwarf rebellion? All right, big guy. We ditched the dwarf thing. We make you guys regular rattlers.
No, it's too late.
He looked at Jay and me. We looked away. Rabbit was now angry and he pushed Kevin hard with the palms of his hand. Kevin tried to ram him in the stomach, but he stepped aside, throwing Kevin into the curb where he fell to the ground, bleeding profusely at the knee. Still, he managed to get up.
My street.
Kevin shouted at Rabbit, pointing at him with an angry index finger.
Find out more by Googling Boots in Manhattan, a 1940s coming-of-age novel, part 1 of the novel series The Foot Soldier by Ray Boylan and Johnny Bluestar. Google with the words, Boots in Manhattan, Ray Johnny Kindle. That's Boots in Manhattan, Ray Johnny Kindle.
We're back on Threshold Radio with our last few moments with Robert Snow, author of Portrait of a Past Life Skeptic and a former commander of the Homicide Division of the Indianapolis Police. One of the most exciting interviews I've ever had. Tell us, Robert, a little bit about your current thoughts on reincarnation. What have you learned that isn't in your books?
Well, actually finding the proof of it wasn't the hard part. I mean, I kept finding one thing after, I had these 28 facts. I kept checking them off one after another. And you finally get all 28 checked off. That wasn't the hard part, accepting what I had proven. What the hard part was accepting what this means to your worldview. In other words, yes. I had to stand back and look and realize that the worldview I'd held my whole life was wrong. That the world didn't operate on the parameters I thought it operated on. And the people I had always kind of rolled my eyes at and snickered were right, and I was wrong. And that, to me, that took longer than anything to actually come about and get and kind of formulate and accept a whole new world view of how the world works.
Did you ever think your books would be found in a New Age bookstore?
No, I didn't. No, I must admit, no, I didn't. When I first started becoming a writer, because before I wrote books, I had over 100 articles and short stories published in various magazines, and they were all in police magazines and other very established magazines. And I had I never thought I'd be in a New Age bookstore ever.
What did you think about the connection between this man, Beckwith, and your own life? Do you feel that there was a connection, a continuity of any type?
There is, and it's one of those things. You don't put everything in a book because it looks like you're trying to force feed people. But there were so many parallels between Beckwith's life and mine. It's really amazing. It really is. But again, I felt like if you put too much in the book, it's like people think, God, he's trying to force this. You're trying to force feed you this stuff.
Could you share a little bit of that with us?
Well, it's like I said, when Beckwith at the last part of his life, again, he was so weak he couldn't stand up anymore because he had endocarditis, which what eventually killed him. And so for the last year or two, he decided to become a writer. He has stuff published. And again, from my very first memories, that's the only thing I ever wanted to be. It's kind of like a continuity.
Yeah, definitely.
On forward from him, from him to me type thing. And I was telling you about the various coincidences. In Beckwith's diaries, he mentions a number of times about scrapbooks, about how he's working on a book on scrapbooks. I could not find out where they were at. I could not find any information. Everybody I checked, all the resources, nobody knew where his scrapbooks were at. Of course, he wasn't, to be honest, he wasn't that famous. So there's not much recorded about him. He wasn't, that famous or that good. So anyway, I talked to an art dealer, and he was actually in New York. And he was telling me, he said, well, there's an awful lot of fraud in American art. So I have an expert in American art. She might have some information about Beckwith for you.
Really?
And so he gave me to her, and her and I are talking about something else. And out of the blue, I hadn't asked her anything yet. She told me, says, his scrapbooks are to the New York Historical Society, right? And it just caught me by surprise because I hadn't asked her anything about scrapbooks, or we were just started talking. I hadn't mentioned a word to anyone. I hadn't mentioned to the art dealer himself or anyone about the scrapbooks. And she, again, it was one of the things she just kind of blurted out real sudden and said, do you know what scrapbooks are to the New York Historical Society? Things like this kept happening about Beckwith, where information, again, would just be dumped in my lap.
So would you say, Bob, that you were kind of being guided?
Yeah, oh yeah, very obviously so. Now, when I look back on it, at the time I didn't. At the time I kept resisting thinking that. But as I look back on it now, most certainly, something was guiding me, something pushing me toward this. Because because actually there were several times writing this when I would get worried. I would listen to what my wife said. She said, boy, the police department's not going to like this, you're going to get in trouble. And several times I actually thought, I'm not going to do this. I'm changing my mind. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to write this book. I'm going to send back the advance and go on writing because I had other subjects I was working on, and actually were police oriented. Then something bizarre happened. For example, one day I had decided, I'm not going to write this anymore. That's it. I'm not going to write it. This is silly. I'm going to ruin my police career. I'm going to ruin my writing career. That morning I decided, I got a call from a lady who was a researcher for the Berry Hill Art Gallery in New York City. And she said, I heard you're asking about, you're doing research on Beckwith, because I had card number art dealers about him, like I said, I told you about.
Right, sure.
And she said, I hear your sister. She said, well, I want to know, have you found where some of his paintings are? Because again, at this time still, there was no internet, so central listing of paintings. I says, yeah, I found a number of paintings. Why? She said, well, Berry Hill Gallery is going to have an exhibition of his work. We've been planning this for a couple of years.
Wow.
And the really interesting part is, it was the art exhibit was opening on the very same day my book was going to be released.
Really?
Yeah, the exact same day.
Did you go?
Yeah, I did eventually. Yes, I did go see it. But the interesting part is, I asked her, I said, wait a minute. I said, Beckwith's paintings have never been in demand. He wasn't that good a painter. Why would he have an exhibition of his work? And she said, I don't know. So I don't remember. Said somebody mentioned it a couple of years ago. We decided to do it. Interesting enough, they had an exhibition there for 30 days. They sold 0 paintings. Didn't sell a single one. But
wow.
He simply wasn't that good or that famous.
Well, what did you think of his paintings yourself? I mean, did you like them?
Yeah, okay. I'm not an art aficionado. I don't know too much about art. But again, he was competent enough to make a living as a portrait painter, but not so great that people would remember him.
Right now, Robert, we're about to leave, but I want you to give some contact information about your website or how to order one of your books before we leave.
Any Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all of them have my book. It's by Lou Allen, a publisher there in Minneapolis. You can get on Amazon, like I said, Barnes & Noble. And I have a website on Amazon. If you type my name into Amazon search engine, it'll take you to my Amazon website, which lists not only this book, but all my other books too.
Well, that's great. I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and it's been, as I say, one of the most exciting times I've had. Well, everybody, join us again on Threshold Radio next week, Saturday, 10 to noon on Pacific time. And we're going to go out with a wonderful rendition by Patricia Welch of the classic Night and Day.
When No matter, darling, where you are, I think of you. Night and day, day and night. Why is it so that this longing for you follows wherever I go? In the roaring traffic's boom, in the silence of my lonely room, I think of you. Night and day, night and day, under the hide of me, there's an oh such a hungry yearning burning inside of me, and its torment won't be through till you let me spend my life making love to you day and night, night and day.
Views and opinions expressed on this program were those of the hosts and guests and did not necessarily reflect those of Vegas All Net Radio, its affiliates, or its parent companies, 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 or or its parent company, 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 or its parent